The rumble of the train had become something akin to a heartbeat, low and constant, pulsing through the air as the world outside blurred into an unchanging twilight. The carriage was dim, the lights flickering faintly overhead, their weak glow casting long, distorted shadows against the walls. Evelyn sat by the window, staring out into the passing landscape. She had no idea how long she'd been there, no memory of boarding the train, and every time she tried to recall a specific moment, her mind recoiled as if reaching for a fragment that disintegrated in her grasp. The people around her were slouched in their seats, unmoving, their faces vacant like mannequins left too long in a store window. Why can't I remember anything? Evelyn's fingers tapped a steady rhythm on the armrest. It was a nervous habit she couldn't shake. Her reflection in the window was gaunt, her cheeks hollow, eyes wide with a panic that she tried to swallow down. Outside, the town slid past. The same town she'd seen 100, maybe 1,000 times. Always the same row of houses with their sagging roofs, the same church steeple rising against the bruised sky, and the same crooked street lamps that never seemed to light. The repetition gnawed at her, a gnawing sensation she couldn't name. She pressed her forehead against the cool glass, but it did little to calm her racing thoughts. The train kept moving, always moving. The other passengers were still. Some were asleep, heads lolling against the seats in awkward angles. Others stared blankly ahead, their eyes unfocused, their lips moving as though caught in a conversation with ghosts. Evelyn had tried speaking to them before, but all she got in return was silence. Or worse, a slow turn of the head. Like they'd forgotten how to respond. Forgotten what words were. Tonight, something felt different. The air in the carriage felt thicker, like she was wading through a suffocating fog. She shifted uncomfortably, feeling a prickle at the base of her skull, a sensation that was almost like being watched. But when she glanced over her shoulder, the passengers were the same, mute, indifferent. A familiar itch crawled beneath her skin, an urge to do something, anything, to break the monotony. The town outside grew closer again, just as it always did, looping back into view like a poorly rewound tape. Her heart thudded heavier in her chest, as though it was struggling to keep pace with the rhythm of the train. She squinted through the grimy glass. The dark outlines of houses crept into view, half consumed by the shadows. And then she saw it. Someone was standing by the tracks. It wasn't the familiar flicker of an old scarecrow, or a trick of the light from a distant building. This was a figure, upright, shoulders square, facing the train as it rolled by. Evelyn's breath hitched, but she kept her eyes locked on the figure, her pulse quickening in her temples. The person didn't move, didn't flinch, despite the train's relentless approach. As they passed, Evelyn caught a fleeting glimpse of a face, or the impression of a face, before the figure was swallowed by the fog. She shot up in her seat, her sudden motion sending a jolt of energy through her weary limbs. Her mind raced. Who was that? Had they been there all along? Was she just now noticing because something had finally changed? Her stomach churned with the weight of uncertainty. She scanned the faces of the passengers again, hoping someone else had seen it, that maybe, for once, they might react. But they didn't. They sat there, as if the world outside didn't exist. Evelyn's mouth went dry as the nagging sense of dread burrowed deeper, like something was gnawing away at her insides. I have to get out of here. The thought formed in her mind before she could fully understand it. But once it took root, it refused to let go. The train had become a prison, an endless cycle that suffocated her in its stillness. Her muscles tensed, her fingers curling into fists as she fought against the rising tide of claustrophobia. She had no idea where she was or how she had gotten on this train, but she had to leave. Pushing herself up, she stumbled down the narrow aisle, the train swaying beneath her feet. Her breath came fast now, her pulse a thunderous drum in her ears. The conductor's booth was just ahead, and though she had approached the door before, she never dared knock. The conductor had always been an afterthought, a distant figure wrapped in the machinery of the train, never speaking, never seen. Now, that seemed wrong. Everything about this train seemed wrong. Reaching the door, she hesitated only for a moment before rapping her knuckles sharply against the wood. The sound was swallowed by the hum of the train. She knocked again, harder this time, and then, after what felt like an eternity, the door creaked open. The man standing there was not what she expected. He was hunched, his uniform rumpled, his skin waxy and pale, as though drained of vitality. His eyes flicked to her, glassy and distant, yet he acknowledged her with a stiff nod. "I need to get off this train," Evelyn said, her voice more urgent than she intended. "I saw someone outside. I need to leave." The conductor's lips parted, but no words came. Instead, his expression shifted. Just slightly. Just enough for Evelyn to catch a glimpse of something behind his dull eyes, a flicker of recognition. But then it was gone, replaced with the same blank indifference she had seen in the other passengers. "We don't stop," he murmured, his voice a rasp that grated against the quiet. "No one leaves." A chill settled over Evelyn. But this time, it wasn't the cold of fear. It was something deeper, an understanding, blooming darkly in the pit of her stomach. She was part of this train, bound to it, and no one ever truly left. The conductor's words clung to Evelyn like a thick fog. "No one leaves." The certainty in his voice echoed in her mind as she staggered back, retreating down the narrow aisle. Her eyes darted from passenger to passenger, searching for some flicker of recognition or rebellion in their slack faces. Nothing. They sat still, unmoving, as if they were hollowed out, emptied of everything that made them human. She swallowed hard, her throat tight. "I'm not staying here. I can't stay here." The train's hum vibrated through her body, relentless, like it was trying to lull her into the same numbness that had swallowed the others. But her nerves felt too raw, too exposed to surrender to that emptiness. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to break free, to find that person by the tracks. The one real thing she had seen in what felt like an eternity. Evelyn moved with purpose now, her breath quick and shallow, each step feeling heavier than the last. She reached the door at the far end of the carriage and gripped the handle tightly, twisting it with more force than necessary. The door groaned but didn't open. Panic flared in her chest. She yanked it again, harder this time, but it wouldn't budge. It was locked, sealed as though the train had been built to contain her. Her heart hammered against her ribs, not from fear, but from the mounting frustration that churned beneath her skin. She couldn't let this be the end. The figure by the tracks had been real. They had to be, and if they were real, then there had to be a way out. She scanned the ceiling, the walls, looking for anything, an emergency release, a break in the glass, some crack she could exploit. Her mind raced through every escape plan, but none of them seemed feasible in the suffocating confines of the carriage, the windows. She pressed her hands flat against the glass, peering out at the town as it rushed past again, the same blur of rooftops and darkened streets. But the glass was thick, solid. There wasn't even a latch to open it. Her breath fogged the window, and for a moment, the reflection of her face stared back at her, gaunt and haggard. The person she saw didn't even look like her anymore. She wiped her sleeve across the glass, and that's when she saw it again, the figure, standing there by the tracks, just as before. They were closer this time, their form more distinct. The sight sent a shock of energy through her body. She wasn't imagining it. There was someone there. Someone who hadn't been swallowed by the train's endless loop. If she could just get to them, maybe they could help her escape. Maybe they held the answers to this nightmare. She took a deep breath, steadying herself, and turned back to the door. This time, she didn't hesitate. Grabbing the handle with both hands, she heaved with all her strength, pulling until her muscles burned, until her knuckles turned white from the strain. The door didn't budge. No. She clenched her teeth and kicked at the bottom of the door, again and again, ignoring the dull thud of pain in her foot. She could feel the train resisting her, like it was alive, like it was holding her in place on purpose. Her pulse pounded in her ears, the sound of it loud and insistent. And then, with a groan of metal, the door cracked open. Evelyn didn't wait. She wedged her fingers into the gap and pried it wider, enough to squeeze through. The rush of cold air hit her like a slap to the face, sharp and biting. Her feet hit the metal steps outside, and for a split second, the train kept pulling her along, as though it was trying to drag her back inside. But then she was free, tumbling off the train, hitting the gravel beside the tracks hard enough to scrape her palms raw. She gasped, the air around her thick with the scent of earth and dampness. The train roared on without her, its wheels grinding against the tracks as it sped away into the night, disappearing into the fog. She lay there, chest heaving, staring up at the clouded sky. For the first time in what felt like forever, She was off the train. But something wasn't right. As she pushed herself up, wincing at the sting in her palms, she looked around. The town wasn't what she had expected. What had seemed quaint and familiar from the train windows now loomed over her like a ghost town. The buildings were dilapidated, their windows shattered and gaping like open mouths. The streets were empty, and a thick mist curled through the air, clinging to everything like a shroud. The silence was oppressive, pressing in on her ears, broken only by the distant sound of the train's whistle as it vanished into the distance. She staggered to her feet, wiping dirt from her clothes. What happened here? The town she thought she had seen from the train was a lie, a mask. This place, this broken, abandoned version of it, felt like the truth. She moved cautiously through the streets, her breath hitching in her throat, every nerve on edge. The buildings loomed tall, their silhouettes strange and warped in the fog, like memories that had been twisted beyond recognition. She passed an old cafe, its sign hanging crooked, one of the windows boarded up. A small shop front stood next to it, its door ajar, creaking in the slight breeze. Everything felt wrong, out of place, as if the town had been frozen in time and left to rot. And then she saw the train station. It was smaller than she expected, barely more than a shack, overgrown with vines and weeds. The roof sagged, and the paint peeled in long, curling strips. She approached it slowly, her heart beating in time with the faint hiss of the wind. There was something about the station that tugged at her mind, like a memory she couldn't quite grasp. Her hand trembled as she reached for the door, pushing it open with a soft creak. Inside, the air was stale, thick with the scent of decay. Papers littered the floor, yellowed with age, and a single lantern hung from the ceiling, swaying slightly even though there was no wind. She stepped forward, her eyes scanning the mess of documents scattered around. And then she saw it, a ledger, open on the desk. Her name was there, listed among countless others. But the date beside it was impossible. It was from decades ago, far too long for her to have been alive. The handwriting was neat, almost meticulous, but seeing her own name scrawled there sent a chill through her bones. How is this possible? Her legs felt weak, like the ground beneath her was shifting. She stumbled back, her pulse racing as her mind tried to piece together the fragments of the impossible truth. She hadn't just boarded the train. She had been on the train for years, trapped in a loop she couldn't escape, living the same passage through the town over and over again. And now that she had left, the town was unraveling before her eyes. The weight of the ledger in Evelyn's hands was unbearable, as though the yellowed pages were carved from stone instead of paper. Her name stared back at her, etched in ink that had no right to exist. Decades. It had been decades since she had boarded the train, though to her, it felt like only moments, or perhaps hours, had passed. The ground beneath her shifted with the magnitude of that realization, and the world itself seemed to bend and twist, warping in the periphery of her vision. Her breath came in shallow bursts, but there was no comfort in it. The air tasted stale, heavy with dust and decay, and the train station, the station she thought was merely a forgotten relic, now felt like a tomb. She could feel the walls closing in, the shadows stretching toward her like grasping hands. She had to leave. But where could she go? The figure. The memory snapped back into place like a puzzle piece, sharp and sudden. The figure by the tracks. Whoever they were the only real thing in this nightmare, the only constant in the chaos. Evelyn shoved the ledger away, her heart hammering wildly as she stumbled out of the station and back into the fog-drenched streets. The town loomed around her, darker now, more oppressive, as though the buildings themselves had become sentient, watching her with silent malice. Her feet pounded against the cracked pavement as she ran. The fog swallowed her footsteps, and her breaths felt thick, like trying to inhale through a veil. The sound of the train, that ever-present hum, was gone now, and the silence pressed down on her with a weight that made her ears ring. She scanned the shadows, her eyes darting across the darkened streets, searching desperately for that figure, anything to anchor her in this twisted reality. As she rounded a corner, there they were, standing at the edge of the tracks, just like before, but closer now, more distinct. The sight of them sent a jolt of energy through her, and she sprinted toward them, her voice a ragged whisper through the suffocating air. "Who are you?" Her words barely left her lips, but they echoed in her mind. What is this place? What happened to me? The figure, still faceless in the swirling fog, raised an arm. It wasn't a gesture of welcome. It was pointing. Evelyn's pulse quickened as she followed their direction, her gaze drifting toward the old train tracks, now barely visible beneath layers of dirt and overgrowth. She recognized the tracks, not just from her countless journeys past them, but from somewhere deeper. A memory, hidden in the shadows of her mind, began to surface. The fog shifted around her, and suddenly she wasn't standing by the abandoned station anymore. She was there. The day it all began. The sun was setting, casting long, golden beams across the town. She could hear laughter in the distance, the hum of daily life just winding down. It was peaceful then, familiar in a way that twisted her insides with grief. She hadn't always been a passenger on that cursed train. She had lived here once. The memory of it was like a bruise she hadn't realized she was carrying, tender to the touch, but she pressed on. And then she heard the train whistle. It was louder now, cutting through the fabric of her memory like a blade. She was on the tracks, standing just a little too close, the whistle screaming in her ears. Evelyn's breath caught as her vision wavered, and she saw herself, years younger, reckless, standing at the edge of the tracks as the train bore down on her. She remembered the argument she had with the conductor, a man whose face she could no longer picture. She had been so angry, so desperate to make him stop. She wanted to halt the train, as if somehow stopping it could reverse time, undo the mistakes she had made that day. But in her rage, in her blind emotion, she had stepped too close. The impact was a blur. She felt the jarring sensation of metal against flesh, the sickening jolt as the train plowed through her. But this time, she didn't die. She didn't fade away. Instead, she felt herself pulled into the very fabric of the train, her existence intertwined with its endless journey, her body shattered, but her consciousness trapped in the perpetual loop. She hadn't just boarded the train, she had become part of it. The train hadn't claimed her out of nowhere, she had caused it. The loop, the endless passing of time, it was all her doing, born from that fateful moment of impact. The train had answered her wish to undo the past, but in the most twisted way imaginable. It had granted her an eternity of trying, over and over, to escape what she could never undo. The fog thickened again, dragging her back to the present. She stood once more beside the faceless figure, her limbs shaking, her breath shallow. She understood now. The figure wasn't just showing her the past, it was giving her a choice. She could continue the cycle, trapped forever in this broken reality. Or she could confront the truth and stop the train for good. But to do that, she would have to sacrifice what little was left of herself. "I did this," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I'm the reason the town is trapped." The figure remained silent, still pointing toward the tracks. But the fog around them began to dissipate, revealing the train in the distance. It was coming just as it always did, rolling through the town like a ghost. Evelyn's heart pounded in her chest. She could hear the wheels grinding against the tracks, feel the rumble beneath her feet. And she knew what she had to do. She took a step toward the tracks, her legs weak but determined. Each step felt like it carried the weight of years, decades even, but she didn't stop. The train's whistle pierced the air, louder now, more insistent, and the ground trembled as it approached. The final moments of her life replayed in her mind, but this time, she wouldn't let it end the same way. Evelyn stepped onto the tracks, standing in the exact spot where she had been struck all those years ago. The train was close now, hurtling toward her, but she didn't flinch. This time she welcomed it. She needed to be here. She needed to make it stop. The wind from the train whipped around her, cold and sharp, but she stood firm. And then, with a deafening roar, the train collided with her once more. But this time, something was different. There was no pain, no sense of her body breaking. Instead, she felt a release, a weight lifting from her chest, as though the chains that had bound her to this endless loop were finally snapping. The train's whistle faded, and the rumble of the tracks quieted. Slowly, the town began to shift, its edges softening, the shadows receding. The train rolled to a stop for the first time in decades, its wheels groaning in protest. The loop was broken. Evelyn stood on the tracks, her body whole, but she knew she was no longer part of the world she had left behind. The figure, her guide through this ordeal, was gone, and so was the train. The town, once suffocated by her presence, began to return to life. the fog lifting to reveal a sky no longer trapped in twilight. Evelyn smiled, the first real smile she'd felt in what seemed like eternity. Her sacrifice had freed the town, and in doing so, she had freed herself. In the distance, the sound of a train whistle echoed once more, faint and far away, but this time, Evelyn wasn't afraid. She had finally stopped the train. And with that, she let herself fade away, at peace.